Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us in person or virtually on the occasion of the 22nd Annual Maurice and Sheila Bond Memorial Lecture. As most of you will know, Maurice Bond was the honorary custodian of the chapel archives for 30 years, as well as being the first clerk of the records to the House of Lords. His wife Sheila was honorary archivist of St George's from 1954 until her death in 1973. We owe an enormous debt of gratitude to both Maurice and Sheila for their promotion of the historical studies of St George's. Perhaps of even greater importance to the nation was Maurice's role in the preservation of the archives of Parliament. It's a great pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Hannes Kleinecker, from the History of Parliament Trust. He's able to combine Maurice Bond's achievements by exploring the role of the Dean and Canons in Parliament in the Middle Ages. Dr. Kleinecker is the editor of the 1461 to 1504 section of the Official History of Parliament, having previously worked for more than 20 years on the Histories volumes from 1422 to 1461. His research interests include the political, legal, and administrative history of late medieval England, particularly of the southwest of England in the 15th century. His publications include a book-length biography of King Edward IV and a major edition of the pardon rolls of the Yorkist monarchs. He is associate editor of the 15th Century series, book reviews editor of the journal Parliamentary History, an associate fellow at the University of London's Institute of Historical Research, and a convener of the Institute's late medieval seminar, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and an honorary research fellow of Royal Holloway, University of London. Dr. Kleinecker is a past winner of the annual Parliamentary History Prize with an essay based on material about St George's Chapel. He's also a life friend of St George's, with associations dating back to the early 1990s, when, as a student at Royal Holloway, he frequently attended evensong in the chapel and began research in the archives while they were still housed in the airary. Tonight, I know that we all look forward very much to hearing him speak on the hidden presence, the people of St George's Chapel in Parliament in the later Middle Ages. Dr. Kleinecker, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dean, for that kind and very generous introduction. As we are gathered here this evening, like every year for some 22 years now, to celebrate the achievements of Maurice and Sheila Bond as custodians of this college's fine collection of records, it's worth noting that St George's is, of course, not the only place, as the Dean has indicated, where Maurice Bond is fondly remembered. The British Records Association, of which Bond was for many years chairman, now also holds an annual lecture in his memory, but it is above all on the Parliament of the United Kingdom at Westminster that Maurice has left his mark. It was in 1946 that the then 30-year-old Maurice Bond was named Clerk of the Records to the House of Lords, something that at the time must have seemed like a profoundly inauspicious appointment. The clerkship of the records was still a relatively new post, having been created only in February 1946, when Francis Needham, formerly an assistant librarian in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, had been appointed to it. The Palace of Westminster at this time still bore the scars of German bombing. As many of you will know, the Commons Chamber itself had fallen victim to enemy action in 1941. And the parliamentary records had for the war years been evacuated to Laverstock House in Wiltshire, where they'd been stored in less than ideal conditions. Needham's first task was thus to return them to their proper home at Westminster, but to reorganise the dark and dirty interior of the Victoria Tower, where the records were traditionally kept, proved too much for him. And Needham consequently tendered his resignation after just a few months in post. As a final task before leaving, he was charged by the Clerk of the Parliament of the day, Sir Henry Badely, to find a successor. Needham approached the distinguished medievalist Alexander Hamilton Thompson, formerly Professor of Medieval History at the University of Leeds. It was he who recommended the young Mr. Bond. The creation of a dedicated parliamentary record office had been recommended by an official report back in 1937. But with the intervention of the war and the consequent removal of the records from London, little had been done. Bond set about his task with enthusiasm and, in the words of one observer, a flair that had the characteristic of an entrepreneur. Within a few months of his appointment, he drafted a memorandum recommending the steps necessary for the creation of a modern record repository on the parliamentary estate. Over a period of 15 years, 7 new floors, equipped with modern air conditioning units, were constructed in the Victoria Tower, while Bond and his staff not only carried out vital listing and conservation work, but organised a programme of exhibitions and lectures to keep alive the enthusiasm of parliamentarians in both houses. In 1963, finally, the new record office in the Palace of Westminster was opened to great acclaim. Now, of course, while at Westminster Morris Bond was overseeing the process of making the records of Parliament accessible to a wider public, at Windsor, his wife Sheila, as honorary archivist, presided over the Airary, where was stored a different archive with its own significance for English parliamentary history. Different as the two institutions were, there had been contacts and connections between Parliament and the community of St. George's across the centuries. These ties were personal rather than institutional, and it would surely not have been lost on either of the Bonds that Morris's appointment at Westminster in fact stood in a time-honoured tradition. It is this tradition that provides the theme of my lecture here this evening. As my time is obviously limited, I've had to be selective in what I can talk about. So what I propose to do is to focus on a relatively short time frame, the second half of the 15th century, during which the interaction between Parliament and St. George's was perhaps at its most lively. Now, as a regular attender of these lectures, I am conscious that this particular period in time is one to which these lectures have repeatedly returned. But I think that's no accident. For the decades from about 1450 to about 1500 are central to the history of St. George's. These were, of course, the years during which the splendid chapel in which we find ourselves this evening was constructed, and more topically, when it became for the first time of many the site of the burial of a reigning English monarch, King Edward IV. And this, as we've heard in last year's Bond lecture from Dr. Ewan Roger, who I know is in the audience tonight, was also a period when the collegiate foundation at St. George's evolved in many and varied ways. The very term collegiate highlights a characteristic of this institution that is crucial to my approach here this evening. St. George's was and is no monolithic body, but a collective enterprise of individuals, sometimes acting in concert and perhaps at times less so. The same was, and as the media remind us daily still is, even more true of Parliament. Tonight, I therefore want to consider the connections between the College and Parliament in the first instance through the prism of the careers and achievements of a few individuals connected with both. In the latter part of my lecture, I will then discuss the activities of the late medieval men of St. George's in Parliament itself, by looking at a brief but dramatic episode which for several years in the early 1480s saw the affairs of St. George's take centre stage at Westminster. But let me perhaps start by briefly considering what a medieval parliament actually looked like. Now, on this subject, we are surprisingly ignorant. The standard image of a late medieval parliament that you will see in many textbooks and on many websites, and it's indeed on your screen in front of you on the left, is in fact no such thing. It's a purported depiction of a parliament of King Edward I, which is little more than an adapted version of an image of Henry VIII's parliament of 1523, on the right on your screen. Both images are found in Sir Thomas Wriothesley's Garter Book in the Royal Collection, thought to date from about 1530. Another slightly earlier image that I can offer you, and there are details of it on the screen now, is perhaps slightly more realistic. It shows the young Henry VIII and his lords in procession to the opening of the Parliament of 1512. Now, this is pretty to look at, particularly in view of the many and varied costumes of the prelates, abbots, and lay lords shown there, but it actually tells us very little about what a parliament in session would have looked like. Fortunately, other records do serve to fill in some of the gaps. And you may be relieved to know that, costume aside, the medieval English Parliament was not altogether different from that with which we're familiar today. Over the intervening centuries, Parliament has evolved rather than changing radically. Like modern parliaments, those of the Middle Ages were bicameral. That is, they were divided into a House of Lords and a House of Commons. In the Lords sat the secular nobility, the dukes, marquesses, earls, viscounts, and barons of the realm, the two English archbishops, and the bishops of the 19 English and Welsh dioceses. To these came the heads of a, by the 15th century, largely fixed list of 26 English monasteries, all but two of them Benedictine, the other two Augustinian, and the prior provincial of the English Hospitallers, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. The House of Commons comprised two elected knights of the shire from each English county, except for Cheshire and County Durham, and representatives of a selection of cities and boroughs that over the course of the 15th century grew steadily. By the mid-15th century, Westminster had become the normal home of Parliament, although until the 1460s there were occasional and unpopular sessions in provincial towns such as Coventry, Leicester, Bury St Edmunds, and, heaven forfend, Reading. When at Westminster, the Lords usually met in the White Chamber of the Royal Palace, so roughly where the House of Lords is situated today, while the Commons had by the early 15th century swapped the chapter house of neighbouring Westminster Abbey for the monks' more spacious refectory. In procedural terms, perhaps the single biggest difference between the medieval and modern Parliament is that, as you may have heard said elsewhere, the medieval Parliament was an event rather than an institution. What that means is simply that Parliament was not in session more or less permanently, interrupted only by short recesses, but instead met occasionally for a few days or a couple of weeks at a time before being dissolved. But if the time that elapsed between opening and dissolution is to be the measure, Parliament was by the 15th century well on its way to becoming an institution. Parliamentary sessions increasingly lasted for weeks on end, and in several of Edward IV's assemblies, opening and dissolution lay more than a year apart. The Parliament, for instance, begun in October 1472, was not dissolved until mid-March 1475. Otherwise, many of the procedures that are current practice today were also already in place. By the mid-15th century, bills were given multiple readings, that is, debated on multiple occasions, and it was already accepted that in order to become an Act of Parliament, a bill, just as today, required the assent of all three parts of the Trinity of King, House of Lords, and House of Commons. A good example to illustrate just how far medieval precedent is alive and well today is perhaps provided by the procedure followed at the end of each parliamentary session, the prorogation. It is then that the royal assent is formally conveyed for each bill passed by the Lords of the Commons. Today, this is usually done by a specially appointed panel of Lords Commissioners. Once the commissioners have taken their place before the throne in the chamber of the House of Lords, a procedure invariably accompanied by much bowing and doffing of bi- and tri-cornered hats, the Royal Commission providing the authority for the conveying of the royal assent is read, and then the fun really starts. A clerk reads out the title of each act in English, and another clerk replies, in Norman French of course, "Le roi le veut," the king wills it. If to us today this way of making law seems arcane, a late medieval parliamentarian transported by some clever device to the 21st century might be bemused by the tri-cornered hats or the clerk's wigs, but would otherwise find little in this ceremony that was unfamiliar. The ceremony, incidentally, is routinely televised on BBC Parliament, and I do recommend that if you get the opportunity, you watch it. It really is fantastic. But where in all of this are we to look for the men of St. George's, about whom I'm, of course, supposed to speak here this evening? The college's canons were clerics below the rank of the episcopate, and thus sadly had no place in the Lords. Nor did they, as clerks in holy orders, by convention qualify for election to the Commons as representatives of one or other of the cities and boroughs. By yet another convention, the deans and priors of the English and Welsh cathedrals and the archdeacons of each diocese, along with representatives of the cathedral chapters and the diocesan clergy, were indirectly summoned to attend Parliament. As many canons of Windsor were significant pluralists, there were occasionally one or two who would have qualified to attend by virtue of holding archdeaconries elsewhere. But evidence for the attendance of these men is sparse, and if any of the men of Windsor took this route to Parliament, they have left no further trace in the records. There is, however, another and far simpler answer. Our Windsor men may in fact be hiding in plain view and may even be visible in the images of Parliament that I have just shown you. Alongside the Lords and Commons, there was a further group of individuals integral to the work and functioning of Parliament, and that was indeed made up of clerics below the rank of the episcopate. I speak, of course, of the institution's clerical staff. By the end of the Middle Ages, the writing work associated with Parliament was the province of a particular clerk, the Clerk of the Parliaments. This officer employed a deputy who took particular responsibility for the Commons, and in addition, the two clerks of the Crown and Chancery also fulfilled important functions connected with the smooth running of parliamentary business. Where required, other members of the Westminster administration could be drafted in to assist with one piece of business or another. It was common practice for the Crown to reward these functionaries by preferment to ecclesiastical benefices, above all prebends at the secular cathedrals and at the Royal Collegiate churches, of which St. Stephen's Westminster and St. George's Windsor were recognised as the most prestigious. At any one time, a number of the canons of St. Stephen's and St. George's were thus senior officials in the royal administration. As might be expected, many of the clerks of Chancery and Exchequer, whose day-to-day work required their regular presence at Westminster, found preferment at St. Stephen's, while places at St. George's were used to reward men whose offices placed them close to the king's person, such as the clerks of the Royal Armoury and the clerks of the King's Chapel. But the division was far from absolute, and for a time in the 15th century, Windsor became almost the normal home of the clerks of the parliaments. And it is to these men that we must now turn. Now, while in the 1420s there had been several canons of St. George's who could have attended Parliament by virtue of their tenure of archdeaconries, and the Parliament of 1429 had considered the fascinating question of whether the head of the College of Windsor should be formally known as a warden or a dean, the story of St. George's and Parliament properly begins in 1447. In that year, a chancery clerk called John Fawkes was appointed Clerk of the Parliaments. The office was by this day long established. A dedicated clerk had taken charge of the keeping of the records of Parliament by the reign of Edward II, and probably even rather earlier. The office carried considerable prestige and an annual salary of £40, about as much as any clerk could expect to receive, and the equivalent of the annual income expected for a landholder of knightly rank. Central to the clerk's work was the compilation of the principal record of Parliament, the Parliament Roll, as well as the custody of the original acts passed by both houses and approved by the monarch. These records, of course, were those which many centuries later would form the core of the archives presided over by Maurice Bond at Westminster. John Fawkes seems to have originated from Worcestershire and had found employment in the Royal Chancery by the later years of the reign of Henry IV. His ecclesiastical career was in the first instance centred in Sussex, which may have provided easy access to Westminster. He had become involved in parliamentary affairs in the 1430s, when he was repeatedly named among the clerks assigned at the beginning of each assembly to receive petitions from all comers. In 1439, he was appointed Chancellor of Chichester Cathedral, and 2 years later, he became Dean of the Collegiate Church of Hastings, one of the lesser royal colleges used to reward civil servants. And Fawkes certainly earned those rewards, compiling and preserving the records of as many as 10 parliaments from the spring of 1449 to the summer of 1467. On Edward IV's accession in 1461, Fawkes might have been dismissed, as some of his successors were during subsequent changes of dynasty. But Edward recognised his ability and not only confirmed him in post, but also promoted him from the deanery of Hastings to the more prestigious one at Windsor, where Fawkes would remain in post until his death nearly 10 years later. Nor did King Edward's favours to Fawkes stop there. Undoubtedly at the new Dean of Windsor's request, he allowed him to bring with him from Sussex a long-standing associate and factotum, one Thomas Bain. Unlike Fawkes, Bain was a layman, a factor which prevented him from rising to the very top of the clerical career ladder. He was, however, also a trained lawyer who had represented the port towns of Poole and Rye in the 3 most recent parliaments of 1455, 1459, and 1460. He was consequently well versed in the procedures of the House of Commons, and thus an ideal candidate for the post of Fawkes's deputy or Clerk of the Commons, to which Edward IV now appointed him. Thomas Bain would retain this office for an exceptional period of some 36 years, retiring only after Henry VII's penultimate Parliament of 1497, some 5 years before his death in about 1503. In the interim, he not only maintained his connection with his native Sussex, but became a valued counsellor to the Dean and Canons of Windsor, a link which outlasted Dean Fawkes's death in early 1471 by several decades. But Fawkes's and Bain's respective longevity alone does not account for their importance in the history of the medieval Parliament. Fawkes in particular was an administrative innovator whose work has shaped the process of parliamentary record-keeping to the present day. The Parliament rolls of the Middle Ages were little more than a record of the acts that had passed, along with some procedural notes of matters like prorogations or the appointment of the Commons Speaker. Fawkes faithfully continued this practice, but he went further, and it is tempting to suggest that he brought to his professional work the same flair with the characteristic of an entrepreneur, which would be ascribed to Maurice Bond some 500 years later. From early on in Fawkes's clerkship, we begin for the first time to have a record of attendances in the House of Lords, with some terse notes on the discussions that took place at the time. These are direct precursors of the modern journals of the House of Commons and Lords, which contain similar material, albeit over the centuries in an increasingly detailed form. Sadly, none of Fawkes's originals survive, but we do have early modern copies of several fragments dating from the 1450s to 1461. Now, I apologize for the quality of the image there, but on the left-hand side you have an example of one of Dean Fawkes's journals, and for comparison, rather more legibly, one of his later successors, counterparts from 1549 in the reign of Edward VI. Now, these compilations, those on the left, were in the first instance Fawkes's private records of proceedings, which would only acquire an official character in a later period. And they may tell us a little about the man's own orderly mindset and penchant for record keeping. Now, registers of attendance that some of you may recall from last year's Bond lecture were of course also kept at Windsor during the time when Fawkes was Dean. And it is interesting to speculate where here also it might have been he who introduced the practice. And there is also a second body of parliamentary records that has come down to us from Fawkes's day, which is interesting for a different reason. The documents in question, there's an example on the screen for you now, are a collection of exemptions from the provisions of one or other of the repeated acts of resumption passed by Parliament in the course of the 15th century. These were acts of Parliament based on the view that rather than needing to tax his subjects, the king should be able to manage comfortably with the revenues of the Crown estates, provided that he didn't grant away too many of them by way of reward. The Acts thus cancelled all royal grants before a given date and took the property or annuity back into the king's hands. The king was, however, accorded the power to exempt individual grantees from the resumption of all or some of their grants, and suitors in their droves routinely petitioned for such exemptions, today known as provisos. To gain a proviso, an individual or corporate body would have it written out and needed to present the document for personal approval to the king, which, assuming that it was forthcoming, was usually indicated by the monarch's handwritten initials. And the example on your screen, you may just be able to make out Edward IV's sign manual sort of in the middle of the screen left, indicated by the little arrow. The successful suitor could then take this slip of parchment to the Clerk of the Parliaments for enrolment on the Parliament roll in an appendix to the Act of Resumption to which it applied. Now, the chief interest of these relatively mundane documents, which survive in their hundreds, lies less in their content than in the notes that John Fawkes scribbled on them, indicating where he had received them. It's not entirely clear why he would have wanted to record this information, but we may perhaps speculate that it formed part of his personal filing system. Along with perhaps another insight into his mindset, this also offers us a glimpse, however limited, of the busy and peripatetic life that Fawkes led in time of Parliament. His normal place of work during this time was the Parliament chamber in the Palace of Westminster, and here he took delivery of the majority of the documents filed by him, while others, and in their numbers, were delivered to him in his own house. On a number of days, he visited the King's Chamber, and even the more private spaces of the monarch's closet and oratory. At yet other times, he was found in St. Stephen's Chapel, and the meeting place of the House of Commons in the refectory of nearby Westminster Abbey, on his way between these various locations being accosted by yet further supplicants in the Abbey cloisters and in Westminster Hall. Nor for that matter did the Deanery of Windsor afford Fawkes much privacy. His movements during the Parliament of 1467 are less well documented than those of 2 years earlier, but the journey to St. George's was clearly insufficiently onerous to deter all suitors. Fawkes had by then ceased to keep a detailed record of where every individual bill of proviso was delivered to him, but he did note that a number of them had come to his hands at Windsor. Now, the towering figure of John Fawkes, the expert administrator, easily dwarfs many of the men who succeeded him. But his death did not represent a sharp break of the ties between St. George's and Windsor. Fawkes was probably instrumental in recommending as a successor as Clerk of the Parliaments the fellow canon, Baldwin Hyde, who duly assumed the office but was forced to retire following the upheaval of Henry VI's brief reademption. Richard III's Clerk of the Parliaments, Thomas Hutton, was likewise rewarded with a prebend at Windsor, but Richard's defeat at Bosworth saw Hutton dismissed from office, and 2 years later he also resigned his place at St. George's and retired to Lincoln Cathedral. In the autumn of 1485, finally, the clerkship of the Parliaments and the Deanery of Windsor were once more united in the hands of a single man, John Morgan, a Welsh-born second cousin of King Henry VII and future Bishop of St. David's. But in our search for the medieval parliamentarians of St. George's, it is also worth looking beyond the ranks of the dean and canons. There was within the Windsor community another group of royal servants, some of whom also had a track record of parliamentary service. These were the poor knights, the precursors of today's military knights. Now, in the same way as today's military knights joined the community of St. George's at the end of long and distinguished careers in His Majesty's armed forces, so their medieval antecedents also came to Windsor after many years in the service of the Crown, and of this, membership of Parliament sometimes formed a part. In the period with which I'm concerned here today, we know of at least 2 examples of men who had served in the House of Commons prior to being appointed to places at Windsor, and over the centuries there were, of course, also others. Lawrence Leventhorpe spent much of his career in the service of 2 successive Earls Marshal of England, the 3rd and 4th Mowbray Dukes of Norfolk, serving as treasurer of the respective households as well as in other capacities. Perhaps through these lords' patronage, he secured return to Parliament for the Sussex boroughs of Midhurst and Bramber in 1450 and 1472 respectively. When the 4th Duke died in 1476, his only daughter and heiress married Edward IV's second surviving son, Richard of Shrewsbury, who is perhaps familiar to some of you as the younger of the 2 princes in the Tower. This royal connection may explain how Leventhorpe, who is not otherwise known to have been in Crown service, and who, as far as we know, never attained a knighthood, came to be appointed a Poor Knight of Windsor in March 1482. Like Leventhorpe, Christopher Furness had strong connections with the county of Sussex, where he served as controller of the customs in the Chichester district from June 1455. He entered Edward IV's household in the early years of the king's reign as a yeoman of the bottles and the royal buttery, and in 1467 was further rewarded with the post of porter of the outer gate of Windsor Castle. Even by 1463, his proximity to the monarch was such that John Arundel, Bishop of Chichester, himself a former canon of St. George's, called upon his services to procure a royal exemption from attending the Parliament that the monarch had summoned to meet at York that spring. Furness successfully did so, but he spent some £20 in gratuities, which the bishop, when he realised that the planned sessions in the north would never happen, promptly refused to reimburse. Furness himself was returned to the Parliaments of 1472 and 1478 for the Sussex boroughs of Lewes and Bramber. On the second of these occasions, at least, he may have enjoyed the King's direct patronage. The Commons of 1478 were notable for the large number of royal household servants in its ranks, many of them probably the King's placemen. These had been sent to Parliament for the sole purpose of bringing about the condemnation of King Edward's wayward brother, George, Duke of Clarence, whose state trial formed the principal business of that assembly. The Commons did what was required of them, and the King showed his gratitude. In the summer of 1481, Furness was granted the place of one of the poor knights of Windsor. But what was it that the people of St. George's actually did in Parliament? Well, we cannot rule out that they played their part in shaping high politics, but in the absence of a record of any debates, we simply do not know. Of what we do have ample evidence is the college's pursuit of its private affairs. A continual concern for the Dean and Canons was the defence of the college's endowment. I have already mentioned the Act of Resumption, which for much of the 15th century represented one of Parliament's patent solutions to the financial woes of the government of the day. As a major beneficiary of royal patronage, the College of St. George was naturally under considerable threat from such measures, and to procure repeated exemptions was thus high on the Canons' agenda. Other matters transacted in Parliament also concerned the college. Successive canon stewards accounted for payments, often to Thomas Paine, sometimes to other agents, for copies of individual Acts of Parliament. But at no one time were the college's entire resources as heavily focused on Parliament as during a short period from 1483 to 1486. And the events of these years are all the more interesting as they involve not only the Dean and Canons, but also the poor knights. Now, at the heart of the business was, as so often, money. As part of his new foundation of 1348, Edward III had decided to establish a body of 23 impoverished knights who would be housed in the castle and receive wages of 12 per day, as well as an annual stipend of 40 shillings. The college's first statutes of 1352 then increased the number of knights to 26 to mirror that of the Knights of the Garter, in whose place the almsmen were to pray at St. George's. Modest as the sums involved might appear to us, they could in total have amounted to almost £20 per night in any 1 year, and that's night with a K. Had there thus ever been 26 of these knights, their funding would have been far beyond the college's means. And throughout the Middle Ages, the Dean and Canons were thus at pains never to have more than 3 poor knights resident at Windsor at any one time, and often even preferably just 1 or 2. Successive monarchs, nevertheless, continued to appoint additional knights, who often remained in limbo for a number of years before eventually, if ever, gaining admission to a place at Windsor. In spite of repeated attempts at a settlement, none was achieved, and in the early weeks of 1483, finally, the matter came before Parliament. Just how this came about remains unclear. It's possible that the initiative originally came from the poor knights, who had perhaps been spurred on by the unprecedented number of appointments that Edward IV had made in the previous 2 years. In the 12 months from August 1481 to July 1482, no fewer than 10 men, many of them royal household servants, received patents of appointment. Few of them were ever admitted to their places at Windsor, and certainly none at the time. But many of these men must have known each other personally, and some of them may have known each other well, and this may have allowed them to act in concert. The Dean and Canons, for their part, placed the pursuit of their interests in the hands of Thomas Paine, the under-clerk of the Parliaments, whom we've already met. Paine's expertise was not only highly useful in the drafting of the eventual Act of Parliament, but in addition, his position as Clerk of the Commons allowed him to promote the Act in the lower house and to procure its endorsement there. Once the Act had safely passed, it fell to Bain to ensure that it was properly enrolled on the Parliament roll and to provide the College of St. George's with a copy of the text. The Knights' Cause was in the first instance spearheaded by two of their own number, John Kendall and William Overy. Both had close connections with the Crown. Kendall, who'd been a servant of Richard, Duke of York, more than 20 years earlier, became cofferer of the royal household and controller of the King's works on Edward IV's accession. He continued to hold this office until his death, and through its exercise during the first years of the rebuilding of St. George's after 1475, must have become thoroughly familiar with the College of Windsor. He was eventually appointed one of the Poor Knights in March 1482, but died little over a year later without having been formally admitted to lodgings in the castle. Overy, by contrast, is more difficult to pin down. No patent of appointment as a Poor Knight for a man of this name is known, but his likely proximity to Edward IV is indicated by his participation with many other of the King's servants in the Duke of Buckingham's uprising in protest at Richard III's theft of the throne in the late summer of 1483. What connections these two Poor Knights had in Parliament is uncertain, but they evidently enjoyed privileged access to King Edward, to whom they were said to have made great instance and labour, seeking the Knights' incorporation and endowment separately from the Dean and Canons. Now, once again, no details of the parliamentary debate over the issue are known, but Bain evidently did his job well, and the Act of Parliament that eventually passed was everything the Dean and Canons could have hoped for. Not only was the College of St. George formally incorporated, but in a final clause, the Dean and Canons were exonerated once and for all from any payment to the Poor Knights, for whom the King promised to provide in other ways. That should have been the end of the matter. But within 2 months of the dissolution of the Parliament, Edward IV was dead. On his deathbed, he was said to have expressed the wish that the Lincolnshire manor of Long Bennington should be assigned for the support of the Poor Knights. But if this was so, his successors and executors never fulfilled the promise. The Canons, for their part, took this as read and immediately stopped payments to the Knights, who were thus, at a stroke, deprived of any income at all. The Knights' prospects now looked increasingly bleak. As a result of the political upheavals that followed Edward IV's death, a fresh Parliament planned for June 1483 was delayed by 6 further months until 1484. If the Knights immediately began their campaign for the repeal of the Act of 1483, their efforts have left no explicit trace in the records. But the Canons certainly did have to take some steps to guard their interests following Richard III's accession. And thus one of them, John Arundel, spent 16 days in London while Parliament was in session in January and February 1484. As always, the intrepid Thomas Bain, still under Clerk of the Parliaments, also served the College of St. George, and on several occasions the Canons dispatched his son Robert to bring him documents from Windsor, without, unfortunately, recording what these documents were. We may, however, assume that the Knights did not remain inactive during the remaining 20 months of Richard III's reign, and once Henry VII had claimed the throne and summoned a Parliament to cement his rule, they were ready to strike. What connections the Poor Knights had to promote their case in the assembly that met at Westminster in November 1485 is once again obscure, but we do at least know that they opened their campaign with the standard device of a petition to Parliament. Technically, such supplications were to be delivered to specially appointed receivers of petitions by the supplicant, but it was also possible for individuals who were not peers or MPs to present bills in person in one of the chambers directly. The poor knights may have adopted this route, for as Clerk of the Parliaments, the recently appointed Dean of Windsor, John Morgan, was one of the receivers and could have found ways of blocking any approach on the more formal avenue onto the parliamentary agenda. Certainly, the Knights' Bill seems to have caught the canons by surprise. Canon Steward John Seymour paid one Henry Port 2 shillings for, I quote, for writing out a certain schedule placed into Parliament by the Knights. Now, however, the canon's well-oiled lobbying machine swung into action. In view of the violent change of ruler, indeed dynasty, the Windsor chapter had evidently anticipated challenges to their possessions and privileges. And by contrast with 1483, when in the Commons the stewardship of the Act of Incorporation had essentially been left to Thomas Bain, and 1484, when only a single canon had ridden to Westminster to guard the college's interests. In 1485, the influence of most of the prominent members of the chapter and of its full retinue of legal advisers was thrown behind the canon's case. Canon Steward John Seymour arrived at Westminster on the second day of Parliament, remained there throughout the first session until the prorogation of 10th of December, returned again on the 20th of January, 3 days before Parliament reassembled, and left only after the dissolution. Several other senior canons also spent long periods at Westminster while Parliament was in session. John Arundel attended for 50 days, and David Hopton joined them for a period of 17. But even more crucial than the contribution of either of these men was that of Canon Oliver King, someone who is well known to many of us from his chantry chapel in this building. A more recent appointment to the College of St. George than Arundel, Hopton or Seymour, he had served as Edward IV's secretary in the final years of that king's life, and was as a consequence highly familiar with the workings of the Westminster administration. He also had impeccable credentials from Henry VII's point of view, as he had been dismissed from office and imprisoned in the Tower by Richard III. King was paid for spending 31 days in London during Parliament, but also received various other payments of expenses incurred during the same period, and had regular dealings with messengers sent to and from Windsor, carrying documents in support of the college's case. On account of his office of Clerk of the Parliaments, Dean Morgan was present at Westminster throughout the 2 sessions, and although undoubtedly heavily preoccupied with his official duties, he nevertheless also found time to devote himself to the pursuit of his college's interests. On various occasions during the Parliament, he joined King, Arundel and Seymour and the college's legal councillors, sergeants at law, that is, barristers, William Danvers and John Vavasor, in meetings with Thomas Bain, one of the King's councillors, Sir Richard Nanfan, and the Attorney General, Sir William Hodie, to discuss the affairs of the college. These included the defence of the Dean and Canon's title to various estates granted to them by the Yorkist monarchs, but now being reclaimed by the heirs of the men who'd forfeited them to the crown during the 3 preceding reigns. But centrally, they were also concerned with the question of the poor knights. It's not clear at which stage of the Parliament the poor knights presented their bill, but it may have been among a number known to have been read in the Commons in late November and early December 1485, the contents of which are not recorded. It seems to have been introduced or reintroduced in the Commons early in the 2nd session, and was subsequently debated by the Lords on several occasions in February 1486. Now, we cannot be certain who championed the Knights' cause in Parliament. Few of the names of the members of the Commons are known, nor can we be sure whether Leventhorpe and Furness, who at least knew something of the workings of the House, were even still alive. What is clear from the accounts of the College of St. George is that both sides promoted their cases vigorously. In the first instance, the officials who controlled physical access to the Lords and Commons needed to be won over. Canon Seymour paid the porter of the Parliament House that is the Commons Chamber, a man called John Fly, tuppence for his favour. And probably out of similar considerations, on the 1st of February, the Speaker's Sergeant-at-Arms, John Harper, received 20p. Within the chambers, procedure was the main barrier, and the favour of the officials of both houses, as well as the support of professional men from among the membership, needed to be ensured. Thomas Bain could still be counted upon, but prudently, even he was treated to a sumptuous breakfast in addition to being paid his expenses. On the 24th of January, the Speaker of the Commons, Sir Thomas Lovell, whose support could have a serious impact on the passage or rejection of a bill, was paid the substantial sum of 66 and 8. And in subsequent days, other sums of money were distributed to those expected to promote the college's interests in debate. John Vavasour, a King's Sergeant, that is, a KC, as we must now again call them, was rewarded for speaking in the Lords on 3 separate occasions on the 1st, 9th, and 21st of February 1486. It's probable that these dates represent the 3 readings customarily given to parliamentary bills. On the 1st of February, payments were also made to 2 members of the Commons, the lawyers Thomas Limerick and John Mordaunt. The poor knights based their case on the argument that through the machinations of the canons, the Act of 1483 had been made without their knowledge and agreement, and that King Edward IV himself had on his deathbed expressed remorse at having allowed it to pass. The canons, by contrast, claimed that the Act had had the knights' full agreement and had indeed in part resulted from the almsmen's own lobbying of the monarch. Probably on account of the privileged position of the College of St. George as the home of the Order of the Garter, the matter was also debated outside the Lords and Commons chambers. Over 2 days, discussions were held in which 4 Lords Spiritual and 4 Garter Knights joined the King's Secretary Richard Fox, the Almoner Christopher Urswick, himself destined to become a canon and subsequently Dean of St. George's, Speaker Lovell, the Attorney General William Hodie, and other lawyers. But the canons took their efforts further still. Whatever might be passing in the committee of prelates, Garter Knights, and lawyers, or in the chambers of the 2 houses, the King's attitude was clearly of the greatest importance. Consequently, Dean Morgan and Canons Arundel and Hopton joined Canon King in the royal presence when the latter presented Henry VII with a gift of £100 in cash for his goodwill. And in February and March, Canon King was at various times able to discuss the college's affairs privately while riding out with the sovereign. In the event, the canon's efforts bore rich fruit. Not only was the poor knight's call for the repeal of the Act of 1483 rejected, but the college's privileges and endowment, including all of Edward IV's generous settlements, were confirmed in full. In one important respect, however, the canon's victory proved hollow. From the 11th of March 1486, just a week after the dissolution of Parliament, the canon treasurer once more had to pay the wages of 3 poor knights, amounting to more than £54 per annum. On the King's orders, as he recorded tersely, until they should be provided for by the King himself. The poor knights had survived to fight another day. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in this evening's lecture, I have tried to present to you a picture, however fragmentary, of some of the links between the late medieval College of St. George's at Windsor and the late medieval English Parliament. Many of these links were, perhaps necessarily, personal ones, forged by individual people, from John Fawkes to Maurice Bond. And in my discussion of the parliamentary battle between the canons and the poor knights, I have likewise tried to emphasize the agency of individuals and groups of individuals. I want to leave you tonight with one final thought. The people of past centuries can often seem strangely flat characters. Our perception of them limited by the partial records of their lives and concerns that have come down to us. I'm very conscious that in the absence of even a physical image of men like John Fawkes, Thomas Bain, Lawrence Leaventhorpe, or Christopher Furness, this is certainly true of the men of whom I have spoken this evening. And yet, I think it is definitely worth remembering that in their own day, all of these were real, living, thinking people, as real to themselves and each other as we are to each other today. Here at St. George's, we say regular prayers not only for the sovereign and companions of the Most Noble Order of the Garter, but also for all those who, over the centuries, have been members of the wider community of the college here. Among them, we owe a particular debt of gratitude to those from Canon Ollard and Maurice and Sheila Bond to Kate McQuillian and her colleagues, whose work in preserving the college's archives makes it possible to put some flesh on the bones of those whom we remember. And we also owe a debt of gratitude to the Dean and Canons in their several generations for continuing to support the work of the archives and indeed the work of those researching in them. For this, we thank all of them, and I thank you for your attention this evening.
Dr. Kleininger, Hannes, when I was at school, I confess that I failed to show any aptitude at all for the subject of history, and at the age of 13, it was recommended that I give up studying history altogether, along with geography and Latin. Much later in life, I began to realize how important our history is to us, and as I moved around medieval and Victorian parish churches with my job, I soaked up information on little episodes in historical time. Unfortunately, I never quite grasped how all the episodes fit together and never learnt the order in which the kings and queens of England reigned. Since working here as a canon, I have soaked up the history of this place with much more enthusiasm. I have learnt a huge amount from this year's Bond lecture, thank you, as we all have, not only about the college and Parliament in the second half of the 15th century, but also about the background of Maurice Bond, in whose honour, along with his wife Sheila, these Bond lectures are given. My endeavours to understand how all these bits of history fit together has been helped by the mention of such characters as Oliver King and Christopher Erswick, who have featured in previous Bond lectures, not least Claire Riders. They have chapels dedicated to them in this building, and they are remembered with respect and thanksgiving at our quarterly obit services. In the present political climate, it's perhaps a mixed blessing to be told of the links between the College of St. George and Parliament, but it's fascinating nonetheless. And as a canon of Windsor, I look forward to being offered a clerical post at Parliament, like some of my predecessors, especially if it involves the wearing of a tri-cornered hat and offers a wig to keep my head warm in a chilly chapel in winter. It was good to learn that both the canons and the poor knights of Windsor were accomplished in the noble art of bribery and corruption as a means to a desired end. I mean, who could resist the princely sum of twopence, or a sumptuous breakfast. I clearly have much to learn about the conduct of negotiations with the military knights of Windsor of the present age. Annas, we have enjoyed your lecture very much. We have learnt a great deal, and we offer you the sincere and profound thanks of the College of St. George, our archives, and this audience. And to you, sir, I doff my tri-cornered hat.